Hi everyone, welcome back to Pine Hat. I hope you're all doing well. Tonight we're going to talk about Bill Cipher, and we're going to talk about him differently than most people do. We're not going to rank his funniest moments. We're not going to debate how powerful he is. We're going to look at him the way a psychologist would, slowly, carefully, from the very beginning. Because Bill Cipher is not just a villain. He's not just a triangle with a top hat who likes making deals and breaking things. If you look closely, through the show, through Journal 3, through the Book of Bill, through every hidden code and reversed audio track Alex Hirsch ever buried, what you find is a mind. A broken, trillion-year-old mind that lost something it could never get back and has been running from that loss ever since. Tonight, we're going to follow that mind all the way down. So get comfortable. Let's begin.
To understand what Bill Cipher became, you have to start where every psychological story starts. At the beginning, in childhood, in the place where the patterns were first laid down. Bill Cipher did not emerge from nothing. He was not born a demon. He was born into a world called Uklitian. Take a moment to really imagine Uklitian. Not the way we experience a place, with depth and shadow and the feeling of three-dimensional space around us. Imagine a world that is entirely, completely flat. A two-dimensional realm where every living being exists on a single plane, where the concept of up and down has no meaning, where perception is limited to what you can see along a flat line of sight. The Uklitians, the people who lived there, were sentient geometric shapes. They moved through their world the way pieces slide across a surface. Everything they had ever known, everything they had ever been taught to want, everything their society considered beautiful or valuable or worthy, existed within that flat plane. And into that world, a child was born, who could see something no one else could see. Bill had a mutation, a biological anomaly that made him different from every other being in his dimension. He had an eye that gave him the ability to perceive the third dimension, to see up, to understand depth, to look at the flat world around him and see, simultaneously, the enormous thing that lay beyond it, a direction, a dimension. A whole other layer of reality that his entire species was simply incapable of perceiving. Think about what that means. Not metaphorically, literally.
Imagine being a child and seeing something that no one around you can see, being unable to explain it because the people around you do not even have the conceptual framework to understand what you are describing, and having that very ability, that very difference, be treated not as a gift, but as a problem, as something to be corrected, as a deviation. Because that is what happened. Bill's parents, Scalene and Euclid, the two people in Uklitian who genuinely seemed to love him, took him to a doctor. Not a doctor for his eye, in the sense of trying to understand what he was seeing. A doctor whose purpose was to suppress his visions, to give him medicine that would make the third dimension go away. The lullaby his mother sang to him, recovered through hidden codes in the Book of Bill, makes this painfully clear. Stay safe with mommy, you'll never fall, and we'll always love you, sharp angles and all. It is a lullaby built on love, yes, but also on fear.
A mother's fear that her son's difference will hurt him.
A mother's attempt to protect her child by making him smaller than he is. And here is the first psychological truth we need to sit with tonight. When a child is told, repeatedly and consistently, that their most fundamental way of perceiving reality is wrong, something happens in that child's mind. Something profound and damaging. Psychologists call it a rupture in the sense of self. The child begins to experience their own nature as a source of shame rather than pride. They learn that who they are, at the most basic level, is too much, too strange, too different, too inconvenient for the people around them. Some children respond to this by collapsing inward. They become small. They learn to hide. They develop what psychologists call an external locus of identity, meaning they begin to define themselves entirely through how others see them, because their own experience of themselves has been systematically invalidated.
Other children respond differently. They go the other direction. They do not collapse. They inflate.
They take the wound of not being seen, not being understood, not being accepted, and they convert it into something that looks, on the surface, like its opposite. They become grandiose. They decide, at some deep and inarticulate level, that if the world cannot understand them, the problem is with the world, not with them. They begin to construct an identity that is built not on connection and belonging, but on superiority, on being above, on being the one who sees things others cannot see, and rather than mourning that loneliness, weaponizing it. Bill Cipher was always, even as a child in Euclidia, the second kind. Because the records we have of his childhood, fragmentary and filtered through his own deeply unreliable narration, paint a picture of a being who could not accept the flat world he was born into. He called it a world of flat minds with flat dreams. He looked at the people around him, the people who could not see what he could see, and he did not feel grief for them. He felt contempt. He felt a simmering, building frustration that they did not want to be shown, that they had rules against talking about the third dimension, that his very existence was something to be managed and suppressed rather than celebrated. And this is the second psychological truth of Bill's origin. The contempt is a defense. Underneath the contempt is something much older and much more painful. A child who wanted to be understood. A child who wanted to belong. A child who, according to hidden details in the Book of Bill, was probably feared and ostracized by most of his community, despite Bill's own claims that everyone loved him. A child whose closest emotional connection was to the two beings who tried to medicate his perception away, and who he simultaneously loved and resented for it. That combination, love and resentment tangled together so tightly you cannot separate them, is one of the most psychologically significant configurations a developing mind can experience. Psychologists call it ambivalent attachment. The people you are closest to are also the people who hurt you the most. Not necessarily through malice, but through the fundamental incompatibility between who you are and what they need you to be. And when that ambivalent attachment is never resolved, when there is never a moment of genuine repair, of genuine seeing, it leaves a wound. A wound that does not close. A wound that a person, or a triangle, spends the rest of their life either trying to fix or trying to not feel at all. For Bill, the answer was eventually to not feel at all. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay here for a moment, in the childhood, before the disaster. There came a day in Bill Cipher's life when he made a decision that changed everything. A decision that ended a world. He decided to show his people the third dimension. We do not know all the details of what happened. Bill's own memories of this event are fragmented, suppressed, inaccessible to him in ways that are deeply revealing. Anytime he tries to think about the day Euclidia was destroyed, he says there is a loud buzzing in his ears and he blacks out for 30 seconds. This is not metaphor. This is a description of a dissociative response to traumatic memory. What we do know is that the event was catastrophic. Bill tried to show the Euclideans what he could see, the third dimension, and in trying to expand their perception to something their biology and their physics were not designed to contain, they were destroyed. They were bloodily, horrifyingly torn apart. They screamed. They died. Everyone Bill had ever known, including Scalene and Euclid, his parents, was gone. The entire dimension was reduced, eventually, to a single atom that Bill kept in his hat for 1 trillion years. Now stop. Before we go anywhere else, I want you to sit with what that is. It does not matter whether Bill's intention was malicious or not. The records suggest it was not, that what happened was a catastrophic accident, a case of someone genuinely believing they were liberating their people and instead destroying them. What matters for our purposes tonight is not the question of guilt in a legal sense, but the question of what an event like that does to a mind. Because what happened to Bill after the Uklitian massacre is one of the most psychologically precise things Alex Hirsch ever wrote, even if it was delivered in fragments and hidden codes rather than explicit dialogue. Bill did not go mad in the simple sense. He did not break down. He did not sit in the ruins of his dimension and grieve. He did not, as far as we can tell, ever really allow himself to grieve at all. What he did instead was something far more psychologically sophisticated and far more dangerous. He reframed the story. In Bill's official account of the Uklitian massacre, the one he tells to Ford, to others, to himself, what happened is not a tragedy. What happened is a liberation. He freed them. They loved him for it. Everyone was fine. He showed them the stars, and in the showing, he gave them something greater than their flat, dreaming lives had ever offered them. This is not lying in the ordinary sense, or rather, it is not only lying. It is something psychologists call a defensive narrative, a story the mind tells itself in order to survive something it cannot afford to look at directly. Here's the thing about traumatic guilt. Real, bone-deep guilt over something catastrophic, something you did, something that cannot be undone. It is one of the most destabilizing psychological experiences a conscious mind can have, because it attacks the self from the inside. Because it says, you are the source of something terrible. You, specifically, your choices, your certainty, your need to show them something they didn't ask to see. And a mind faced with that kind of guilt has essentially two choices. It can do the extraordinarily difficult work of sitting with the guilt, integrating it, allowing it to change how it sees itself and the world, mourning what was lost, and eventually, painstakingly, constructing some kind of meaning out of the catastrophe. This is what therapists call working through trauma. It is slow. It is painful. It requires a tolerance for self-confrontation that most people find almost impossible. Or, the mind can refuse. It can build a wall. It can decide at some level below conscious awareness that the truth of what happened is simply too costly. That if the full reality of it were ever allowed in, it would destroy the self entirely. And so the mind begins the work of reconstruction. It takes the facts, the real, verifiable facts of what happened, and it covers them with a layer of interpretation that makes them survivable, liberating them. They loved me for it. Everyone was fine. Bill Cipher, over the course of 1 trillion years, became a master of this kind of reconstruction. And here is the most important thing to understand about defensive narratives. They do not stay still. They require maintenance. They require constant reinforcement. Because the truth has a way of pressing against the walls you build around it. You can feel it, sometimes, at the edges of your awareness, in dreams, in moments of vulnerability, in drunk ranting at an interdimensional bar where you call out for your mother and ask her where she went. This is the detail from the Book of Bill that breaks open the whole psychological picture. Bill, drunk and falling apart, calling for his mother, telling her he's coming home from school, asking her to cut the crusts off his sandwiches, asking where she went, not what happened to her, not acknowledging the fire, the screaming, the end of everything, just where she went. The language of a child who has not yet been told that gone is permanent. The language of someone whose grief, buried under 1 trillion years of constructed narrative and conscious reinvention, is still, at its most naked and unguarded, the grief of a baby who misses his mother. There is nothing in all of Gravity Falls lore, no mystery, no revelation, no emotional arc, that I find more devastating than that. And I think it is no accident that Alex Hirsch hid it in a piece of extended universe material rather than putting it on screen, because it changes everything. It means that somewhere underneath the charismatic demon, underneath the god of chaos and deals and dimensional conquest, there is a wound so old and so deep that it has never healed. A wound that was there before any of the evil, before any of the manipulation or the cruelty or the trillion-year campaign to break the wall between dimensions. Before all of that, there was a child who destroyed his world by accident, who could not bear to know that he had done it, and who has been running from that knowledge ever since. After Uklitian, after the massacre, Bill needed somewhere to go. And where he went tells us a great deal about the psychological choices he made in the aftermath of catastrophic loss. He went to the nightmare realm. The nightmare realm is, in the cosmology of Gravity Falls, exactly what its name suggests: a lawless, unstable crawl space between dimensions. A place with no consistent physics, no rules, no order of any kind. A place that is, by its very nature, in a state of constant flux and dissolution. It is the opposite of Euclidia in almost every way. Euclidia had rules. Euclidia had order. Euclidia had flat, consistent, predictable physics that everyone was expected to conform to.
The nightmare realm has none of these things. Why would a being, even a deeply traumatized one, choose to make their home in a place like that? This is where the psychology gets genuinely interesting. There's a concept in trauma theory called a repetition compulsion. It was first described by Freud, though modern trauma researchers have refined and expanded the idea considerably. The core observation is this: people who have been through profound trauma have a tendency, entirely unconscious, to recreate the conditions of the original trauma in their later lives. Not because they want to suffer again, but because the original trauma was never resolved, was never integrated, was never given an ending, and the unconscious mind keeps returning to it, keeps staging new versions of it, in the hope that this time, maybe this time, the story will end differently. Think about what the original trauma was for Bill. He lived in a world of rigid rules. He was different.
He could see something others couldn't see. He was suppressed. He was told to be smaller. He was told his perception was the problem. And then, when he tried to share that perception, when he tried to make his world see what he saw, it ended in catastrophe. Now think about what the nightmare realm offered. No rules, no physics, no order to conform to, no expectations to violate, no authority to answer to. A place where his particular kind of perception, his ability to see in multiple dimensions, his ability to warp and twist reality, was not a deviation, but a superpower. A place where the very things that made him a problem in Euclidia made him a god. There is something deeply logical about this choice, even if the logic is the logic of trauma. You spent your whole childhood being told that the rules were more important than you were. You tried to break the rules because you believed, genuinely believed, that you were showing your world something beautiful. And the rules destroyed your world and everyone in it.
So now you have found a place with no rules at all. You have found a place where no one can tell you that you are too much, because there is no standard of too much, no reference point for normal, no physics to violate, because there are no physics. You have, in other words, found a way to make sure that no one can ever hurt you the way Euclidia hurt you. No one can ever suppress your vision. No one can ever put you on medication to make the real world go away. Because here, in the nightmare realm, you are the realest thing there is. But armor has a cost. Armor always has a cost. Watch how Bill Cipher behaves in the nightmare realm. He does not simply exist in the chaos. He organizes it. He builds a hierarchy. He recruits followers. He makes himself the center, the ruler, the eye around which all the surrounding disorder revolves. He becomes the most organized being in a world of chaos. Notice what that is.
He does not actually abandon order. He recreates order, but with himself at the top. With himself as the one who sets the rules, even in a place with no rules. This is a pattern psychologists see often in people who have been controlled or suppressed in childhood. They don't grow up to be people who genuinely transcend authority. They grow up to become authorities themselves. The control they could not tolerate when it was inflicted on them becomes the thing they most need to inflict on others. Bill Cipher became the ruler of the nightmare realm. He was not free in any meaningful psychological sense. He had simply transferred the center of control from an external authority to himself. He was still organizing reality around questions of power and hierarchy. He had just made sure he would always be at the top. This is not freedom. This is the trauma response wearing the costume of freedom. There is a moment in Gravity Falls, early in the show, where Bill Cipher enters Ford Pines' mindscape and introduces himself. He comes in with warmth, with enthusiasm, with the energy of someone who is genuinely delighted to meet you. He positions himself as a muse, as a helper, as someone who has been watching Ford's work and finds it extraordinary, who wants to offer his knowledge in service of Ford's genius. It is a masterclass in manipulation, but not manipulation in the simple cartoon villain sense,
Not the kind of manipulation where the villain is clearly lying and the audience is just waiting for the hero to figure it out. The manipulation Bill Cipher practices is much more sophisticated than that. It is manipulation grounded in a genuine, almost clinical understanding of human psychology, of human needs, of the specific vulnerabilities that particular people carry. Ford Pines, when Bill found him, was a specific kind of vulnerable. He was brilliant. He was isolated. He had spent years in Gravity Falls investigating supernatural phenomena and had hit a wall, a point where the mysteries of the town exceeded what he could figure out on his own. He was also, beneath the intellectual confidence, deeply insecure. He had spent his whole childhood feeling like an outsider because of his polydactyly, his 6 fingers. He had built his identity around his intellect because his intellect was the one thing that had never let him down. And his relationship with his twin brother Stanley, the closest emotional bond of his life, had been severed in a moment of accident and misunderstanding that had never been properly healed. Ford was, in clinical terms, a high-functioning, isolated individual with significant attachment wounds, a fragile core self-esteem built entirely on intellectual achievement, and an unmet need for genuine connection and being truly seen. Bill saw all of this. In a single Mindscape conversation, Bill saw all of it. And he built his approach to Ford around exactly these vulnerabilities. Not any single one of them, but all of them simultaneously. He called Ford brilliant. Genuinely, specifically brilliant. Not in the vague flattery way that means nothing, but in the targeted way that addresses the specific insecurity. You are special. Your mind is extraordinary. And I, an extra-dimensional being of vast intelligence, choose to spend my time with you. This speaks directly to the part of Ford that has always suspected his outsider status might be because he is too good for the world around him, rather than because there is something wrong with him. He positioned himself as a collaborator rather than a benefactor, not "I will give you knowledge," which would put Ford in a position of dependency and inferiority, but "let us discover things together," which places them as equals, as intellectual partners, as two beings who are both exceptional and who have found in each other a worthy counterpart. This speaks to the loneliness, to the years of working alone, to the need for a relationship where he does not have to be smaller than he is. And he was patient. One of the most underappreciated aspects of Bill Cipher's manipulation style is his patience. He did not rush Ford. He did not demand anything immediately. He let the relationship develop. He let the trust build. He was there for years, as far as we can tell, before he made his real ask. This is the hallmark of what psychologists call a calculated predatory manipulation style, as opposed to opportunistic manipulation. Opportunistic manipulators take advantage of weakness when they encounter it. They are reactive. Calculated manipulators identify specific targets, assess their vulnerabilities in depth, invest significant time in building the relationship before exploitation, and time their real moves with extraordinary precision. The patience itself is a kind of cruelty, because every day that passes, every conversation, every shared discovery, every moment of genuine intellectual connection, every day of that builds more trust, creates more attachment, makes the eventual betrayal more devastating. You are not just betrayed by someone you trusted. You are betrayed by someone who spent years becoming the most important relationship in your intellectual life, specifically in order to be in a position to betray you more completely. But here is where the psychology of Bill Cipher becomes genuinely strange and genuinely interesting, because it is not quite as simple as calculating predator. There are cracks. There are moments where Bill's behavior suggests that he himself is not entirely sure what the relationship with Ford was. There are the drunk scenes in the nightmare realm after Ford shuts down the portal, where Bill is not triumphant or dismissive, but genuinely distressed. What does it mean that the most significant relationship in Bill's trillion-year existence is the one he engineered for the purpose of exploitation? There is a concept in psychology called instrumental attachment. When a being who is fundamentally incapable of genuine connection, or who has learned that genuine connection is impossible or dangerous, develops something that functions like attachment within the context of a relationship they have constructed for instrumental purposes. It is not the same as love. It is not quite the same as caring, but it is also not nothing. It is the closest such a being can come to caring, given the constraints of their psychology. I think Bill Cipher, underneath the manipulation, had something like an instrumental attachment to Ford. Not because Ford was a tool, though he was also that, but because Ford was, possibly for the first time since Uklitian, someone who was genuinely, substantively interesting to Bill.
Someone who could actually surprise him. Someone whose mind, while not nearly as powerful as Bill's, worked in ways that Bill found genuinely engaging. And when Ford betrayed him, when Ford chose to shut down the portal rather than comply, Bill's reaction was not the measured, pragmatic response of a being who has simply lost one pawn among many. It was disproportionate. It was personal. It was the reaction of someone who was not just frustrated by a strategic setback, but genuinely wounded by a rejection. Which tells us something important. It tells us that somewhere inside the trillion-year-old demon, there is still a being capable of something like being hurt, of something like caring what another specific being chooses, of feeling the difference between chosen and not chosen. That does not make what Bill did to Ford okay, not remotely. But it makes Bill more psychologically real. And it makes the story of what he is, what he became, and what he might have been considerably more interesting. If you were to bring Bill Cipher's behavioral profile to a clinical psychologist and ask them to name the patterns they see, one of the first things they would point to is the grandiosity. The grandiosity is everywhere in Bill Cipher. It is in the way he talks, the theatrical self-presentation, the constant awareness of his own performance, the delight he takes in how others react to him. It is in the way he positions himself in relation to others, always above, always the one who knows more, sees more, can do more. It is in the way he talks about his own history, all those eons of conquests, all those dimensions visited and broken and discarded. But grandiosity, in the clinical sense, is not simply arrogance. Arrogance is a character trait. Grandiosity is a psychological structure. It is a way of organizing the self in relation to the world.
And the key thing to understand about grandiosity, the thing that most people miss when they see it, is that it is always, always, always a defense. Grandiosity does not come from abundance. It does not come from a person who is so confident, so secure, so fundamentally at peace with themselves that they have simply run out of room for doubt. That kind of person exists, and they are the most secure, grounded people you will ever meet. But they are not grandiose. They do not need to be. They do not need to announce their superiority because they do not need you to confirm it for them. Grandiosity comes from the opposite of abundance. It comes from a core of self that is experienced as fundamentally insufficient, as potentially defective, as needing to be constantly protected from the scrutiny that might reveal just how small and frightened and lost it really is. The grandiosity is the armor. The constant performance of extraordinariness is the castle wall.
And inside the castle, where the armor cannot reach, is something much more fragile. For Bill Cipher, we can trace the origin of that fragility with unusual precision. It began in Uklitian, where he was different in a way that frightened the people around him, where his parents, out of genuine love, tried to suppress the variability that made him who he was, where a society decided that his vision of reality was a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be celebrated, where a child learned, at the deepest level of psychological formation, that being himself was dangerous, that being too much was unacceptable. And then it was compounded beyond all measure by the massacre. Because whatever defenses Bill might have been building against those childhood wounds, the massacre gave that story a new and terrible urgency. Because now it was not just that being himself was too much for his world, it was that being himself had actually, literally, ended his world. The choice to become grandiose after that, the choice to build a self that is larger than life, that is beyond judgment, that is so far above the possibility of being wrong that no one could ever say to Bill Cipher what his parents' doctor said to baby Billy, that his perception is a problem, that his vision needs to be corrected. This was not an arbitrary character choice. It was the only way, psychologically, to survive what happened. But the cost of Bill's grandiosity is that it requires constant external confirmation.
This is the paradox at the heart of narcissistic psychology. The grandiose self feels invulnerable, feels above needing anything from anyone, but in fact, it is the most needy structure in all of human, or in this case, inhuman, psychology. It needs admiration, it needs reactions, it needs people to be impressed, to be frightened, to be overwhelmed. Because without those reactions, without the mirror of other people's responses confirming its own exceptional nature, the grandiose self begins to feel the cracks, begins to feel the void underneath, begins to hear the buzz in the ears. Watch how Bill Cipher behaves in Weirdmageddon. He has, for all intents and purposes, won. He has broken into the third dimension. He has Gravity Falls under his control. He could, theoretically, be getting on with his actual goal. Instead, he is throwing a party. He is turning people into lawn furniture. He is performing, endlessly performing, for an audience of terrified townspeople and his own henchmen. Why? Why does the most powerful being to ever threaten the Gravity Falls dimension need to perform? Because the performance is not incidental to what he wants. The performance is what he wants. Or rather, it is what the deepest, most broken part of him needs. It needs to be seen. It needs to be acknowledged. It needs the world to understand, in visceral, undeniable terms, that this being here, this triangle with the hat and the terrible power, this being is not something that can be suppressed, is not something that can be sent to a doctor to have its vision corrected, is not something that can be made small. Bill Cipher in Weirdmageddon is, among other things, the psychological conclusion of what started with a lullaby and a doctor and a child who could see something no one else could see. There is one specific thing about Bill Cipher's psychology that I want to spend some time on, because I think it is the most revealing and the most underappreciated aspect of how he was written. Bill Cipher cannot possess you without your consent. This is presented in the show as a limitation, a plot mechanic. Bill cannot simply take over a body. He needs you to shake his hand. He needs you to agree to a deal, even if the terms of that deal are twisted in his favor, even if he has manipulated you into a position where refusing feels impossible. There must be consent. There must be agreement. There must be a handshake. In one sense, of course, the deals are the purest expression of his manipulative nature. He frames everything as a transaction. He reduces all connection to an exchange. There is no intimacy in a deal. There is no vulnerability. There is no possibility of being truly known, truly seen, truly connected to another being, because every interaction is mediated through the structure of the contract, which is entirely under Bill's control. But here's the other way to read the deals. They are the only way Bill knows how to connect with people. They are his mode of relationship. Not because he coldly chose a relational model that maximizes his advantage, though that is certainly also true, but because the deal is the structure that makes connection bearable for a mind that has learned that genuine connection leads to catastrophe. When Bill connects with someone through a deal, he cannot lose them the way he lost Uklitian. He cannot accidentally expand their perception until they are destroyed. He cannot give them more of himself than the terms of the agreement specify. The deal is a container, a cage, not for the other person, or not only for the other person, but for the relationship itself, for the terrible possibility that this connection, like the last connection, like every connection, might end in fire and screaming and a trillion years of buzzing in the ears. This reading makes the deal structure not just manipulative, but also, in a broken way, protective. Bill Cipher has been running from genuine connection for a trillion years. Not because he does not need it, the drunk crying for his mother makes clear that he needs it enormously, but because genuine connection in his experience is how the world ends. So he does the thing that many traumatized people do. He creates a version of connection that feels like connection, that has the structure of connection, but that is never quite real enough, never quite close enough, never quite vulnerable enough to risk the catastrophe of truly being known. The deals are Bill Cipher's closest approach to love, and they are also his most effective defense against it. One of the most immediately striking things about Bill Cipher, the thing that makes him different from most animated villains, is how funny he is. Not just villainous in an entertaining way, genuinely, consistently funny. His timing is impeccable. His observations are sharp. He has a quality of genuine wit, of finding the absurdity in situations and leaning into it, that makes him, in many of his scenes, more fun to watch than anyone else on screen. He laughs constantly. He delights in things.
He seems, if anything, to enjoy himself too much, to take an almost unseemly pleasure in the chaos he creates and the distress he causes. And here is what a psychologist would say about that. The humor is not incidental. The humor is structural. The humor is one of Bill Cipher's most important psychological tools, and not just because it makes him charming or because it disarms people who might otherwise be frightened. The humor is important because of what it does for Bill himself. In clinical work, therapists sometimes see what is called affect regulation through humor. The technical description is long and complicated, but the core observation is simple. Laughter is a way of metabolizing experience. When something is funny, when you find the comedy in a situation, you are doing something to that situation. You are reframing it. You are asserting a kind of control over your experience of it. You are placing yourself at a slight distance from whatever is happening. And that distance is itself a form of regulation. For people who have experienced profound trauma, humor can be one of the most effective defenses available. If you can laugh at pain, at cruelty, at the terrible things that happen, then you are not at the mercy of those things. You are, in a sense, above them. They become part of the show, part of the entertainment, rather than part of the wound. Look at what Bill Cipher finds funny. Pain is funny. His own pain is funny. When he is in Dipper's body and deliberately hurts himself, he laughs about it. He finds it hilarious that pain even exists, that bodies can feel things, that there is an uncontrolled vulnerability built into the experience of having a physical form. Why would pain be funny to Bill Cipher specifically? Because Bill Cipher has 1 trillion years of practice in not feeling it. Not his own pain, not the pain he caused. The laughter is the defense. Every time something hurts, even in the low-stakes way of being in a 12-year-old's body, the laughter is the mechanism that processes it away. The laughter is the wall. The laughter is what keeps the buzzing in the ears from getting too loud. There is also a specific quality to the cruelty in Bill's humor that is worth examining. He does not laugh at abstract things. He laughs at specific people, at their specific reactions, at the particular ways in which they are frightened or confused or overwhelmed. He is intensely interested in how people respond to him. Not just in a strategic sense, though that is also true, in a personal sense. In the sense of someone who needs, very much, to see his own power reflected in the faces of others. This is what psychologists would call sadistic gratification in the context of narcissistic supply. When Bill laughs at someone's fear, he is doing multiple things simultaneously. He is asserting the distance that keeps him from being affected. He is processing the situation through humor to maintain his emotional regulation. And he is getting confirmation of his own power, his own significance, his own overwhelming reality from the reaction of the person in front of him. It is, in other words, another form of the deal, another way of making connection safe by controlling it completely. If you are laughing at someone's fear, you are not connecting with them. You are feeding on them. And feeding cannot hurt you the way connecting can. Let's talk about something directly now. Something the psychology would not shy away from. Bill Cipher, by any clinical standard, exhibits what would be described as severe antisocial features. Not antisocial in the colloquial sense of preferring to be alone, but antisocial in the clinical, technical sense. A persistent pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. A lack of remorse. A willingness to harm others without the inhibition that empathy normally provides. The checklist is long and essentially complete in Bill's case. Deceitfulness, using aliases, conning others for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity, irritability and aggressiveness, reckless disregard for the safety of others, consistent irresponsibility, lack of remorse.
But I want to push back, slightly and carefully, on the idea that this profile tells us everything about Bill. Because clinical diagnoses are descriptive. They describe patterns of behavior. They do not, on their own, explain where those patterns came from or what function they serve. The antisocial features in Bill Cipher serve a very specific function. They are not random. They are not simply what happens when a being is born evil or born without a conscience. They are what happens when a being builds a life on the foundation of not being able to afford empathy. Empathy is dangerous when you have the history Bill has.
Real empathy, the kind that actually lets you feel what another being is feeling. The kind that would let you understand what it means to the people around you when you do what you do. That kind of empathy would require Bill to know, every time he caused pain, every time he manipulated and destroyed and twisted reality for his own ends, exactly what he was doing to another mind. And if he could know that, really know it, he would be very close to knowing what he did to Uklitian. He would be very close to the buzzing in the ears, very close to the 30-second blackout. The antisocial features are, in this reading, a further extension of the defensive narrative. Not just rewriting the story of what happened, but making it structurally impossible to fully feel the impact of what you do to others. Because if you felt it, you might understand it. And if you understood it, you might have to put it next to what happened in Uklitian. And if you put it next to what happened in Uklitian, you might finally have to feel that too. This is not an excuse. The insight that trauma drives the antisocial features does not make those features okay. It does not make the harm Bill caused less real. It does not make the victims less important. But it is a more truthful account of what is happening psychologically than simply labeling him evil and moving on. Because evil is not a psychological concept. Evil is a moral concept. And while Bill Cipher absolutely does evil things, the question of why he does them, the question of what is happening inside the mind that makes these choices, is a different question. And it is one that the show, in its most careful and quietly devastating moments, invites us to sit with. There is something else about Bill Cipher that a psychologist would notice immediately, something that is connected to everything we have discussed so far, but that deserves its own space to breathe. Bill presents himself as knowing everything. He has access to the mindscape, which means he can walk through human memories and thoughts. He has precognitive abilities, at least within limits. He has been alive for 1 trillion years and has observed more of reality than most beings could comprehend. And he uses all of this, constantly, to position himself as the one who always already knows, the one who cannot be surprised, the one for whom all of your plans and defenses and secret hopes are already transparent. I know what you want, he tells people. I know what you need. I know what you're afraid of. And a great deal of the time, he is right. But watch what happens when he is wrong. There are moments in Gravity Falls where Bill is genuinely surprised, where something happens that he did not predict, did not account for, did not see coming. The most significant of these, of course, is the ending of Weirdmageddon, where the memory gun and Stan's sacrifice and the particular nature of the Pines family's love produce an outcome that Bill could not have anticipated. And even smaller surprises, smaller moments of the unpredictable, produce a distinctive reaction. He gets angry. Not the theatrical anger he performs for the audience, not the exaggerated, flailing fury of a villain who is playing a role. Something tighter and colder. Something that looks, briefly, like genuine distress. This is because for Bill Cipher, knowing everything is not just a power, it is a survival strategy. A being that knows everything cannot be caught off guard, cannot have its foundations pulled from under it, cannot experience the kind of sudden, catastrophic loss of control that happened in Uklitian, where one moment everything was proceeding as planned, and then the next moment everything was fire and screaming and gone. Knowledge is Bill's most fundamental armor. Not his reality-warping powers, not his ability to possess bodies or manipulate dreams. Those are tools.
Knowledge is the castle wall. The belief that nothing can happen that he has not already foreseen, that no one can do anything that he has not already accounted for, is what allows him to feel, moment to moment, safe in a way that he can never actually be. Because, of course, he is not truly omniscient. He has limitations. He has blind spots. He cannot see certain things, in the literal sense, because his eye is his vulnerability. He cannot leave the mindscape without being invited. He cannot access protected spaces. He cannot, as it turns out, account for the specific, irrational, unmappable love of a family who chooses each other against all logic. And here is the tragedy of that. A being who genuinely was omniscient would not need to perform omniscience.
A being who is truly comfortable with not knowing would not need to build a life around the appearance of always knowing. Bill's constant presentation of his own total knowledge is, in the most clinical sense, a compensatory behavior. A behavior that exists to compensate for, to cover over, the deep and persistent terror of the unknown, of the thing you did not see coming, of the morning when you woke up and tried to give your flat world a gift and it ended in the worst way possible. Omniscience, or its performance, is Bill's way of promising himself that Uklitian can never happen again, that nothing can happen that he did not see coming, that the buzzing in the ears cannot catch him off guard because he will always, always be one step ahead of it. This is why the moment with Stan is so devastating psychologically, not just dramatically. Not because Stan is stronger than Bill, he is manifestly not. Not because Stan outthinks him. Stan is working almost entirely on instinct and love. But because Stan, with his own specific history and his own specific relationship to memory and identity, does something that Bill's trillion years of accumulated intelligence and precognitive ability simply could not have predicted. He offers his own mind as the cage. Bill cannot model that. He cannot see it coming. Not because it is clever in a strategic sense, because it is an act of love in the specific, particular way that love is always unmappable. You cannot predict what someone will sacrifice for the people they love, not fully, not in advance, because the love itself is not a calculation. It does not follow the rules of the kind of logic that Bill has spent a trillion years mastering. And in the moment that Stan makes that offer, for the first time perhaps in the entirety of his trillion-year existence, Bill Cipher encounters something genuinely, irrevocably beyond his ability to account for. A being that loves more than it fears. There is a question that psychologists ask, sometimes very early in therapy, and sometimes only after months of work, because the timing matters enormously. The question is this: who are you when no one is watching? It sounds simple. It sounds almost like a riddle. But for many people, particularly those who have built their lives around performing a self rather than inhabiting one, it is one of the most disorienting and difficult questions imaginable, because they do not know the answer. Not because they are evasive or dishonest, but because the performance has been going on so long, has been so total and so comprehensive, that the performer has genuinely lost track of whether there is anyone behind the mask. For Bill Cipher, this question has a special kind of weight. Bill presents himself differently to different people and in different contexts. To Ford, he was a muse, a sophisticated intellectual collaborator. To Gideon, he was a powerful ally, transactional in the clearest possible way. To the people of Gravity Falls during Weirdmageddon, he was a god of chaos, enormous and theatrical and terrifying. In the Book of Bill, confined to the therapism, a different version appears, one that is more reflective, more genuinely uncertain, one that is being forced, perhaps for the first time, to sit with itself. Which of these is the real Bill Cipher? The psychological answer is that they all are, and none of them is. What we call the self, the experience of being a continuous, coherent subject moving through time, is itself a construction. It is a story we tell,
a narrative we create and maintain that weaves together our memories and experiences and relationships and values into something that feels like a unified whole. Most people maintain one primary version of this story, with variations in tone and emphasis depending on context. You present differently to your boss than to your closest friend, but there is something underneath both presentations that you would recognize as you, that you would still be if you somehow found yourself completely alone with no one to perform for. For Bill Cipher, that underneath self is the most damaged thing about him. Because the construction of the self requires a foundation, it requires a history that you can honestly claim, a set of memories and experiences that you can actually look at and say, yes, that happened. That is part of who I am. For Bill Cipher, the foundation is the one thing he cannot look at. The foundation is Uklitian. The foundation is his parents' faces as his dimension collapsed around them. The foundation is the 30-second blackout that comes every time he tries to approach that memory directly. And when a being cannot have honest access to their own foundation, cannot honestly inhabit their own history, they become, over time, what Bill has become.
A collection of performances with no actor behind them. A set of masks with no face underneath. An identity built entirely on the present, on power and deals and the reflection of other people's fear and admiration, because the past is inaccessible and the future is a goal that can never finally arrive, because arriving would mean stopping, and stopping means having to feel what there is to feel when the performance ends. This is what therapists call identity diffusion in extremis. The self is not absent, but it is fragmented, scattered across performances and contexts and defensive structures so thoroughly that the being experiencing it has lost the thread that connects them to themselves. The therapism in this reading is not just a prison. It is the first circumstance in 1 trillion years in which Bill Cipher has been compelled to be one thing. One still thing. Unable to perform. Unable to deal. Unable to run from himself into the next chaos, the next manipulation, the next reality-distorting spectacle. Just there, with everything he has been running from. With the buzzing in the ears and the red and blue triangles he draws endlessly on the walls, his parents, always his parents, the wound that started everything. What comes out of that enforced stillness is the most psychologically interesting version of Bill Cipher that has ever been written. Not because he has been redeemed, but because for the first time, the complexity of his inner life is legible, because he has run out of room to hide from it. In the therapism, Bill Cipher is finally, genuinely, terrifyingly alone with himself. And what he finds there, when he stops running, is not nothing. It is everything he couldn't afford to feel. We ended part 1 in the therapism, in the strange, enforced stillness of a being who has finally, for the first time in 1 trillion years, run out of places to run. Let's talk about Weirdmageddon. On the surface, Weirdmageddon is Bill Cipher's triumph. He has broken through the barrier between dimensions. He has a physical form for the first time in his existence. He has access to the third dimension in all its infinite three-dimensional glory. Gravity Falls is under his control. His henchmen surround him. The townspeople are terrified, or turned into stone statues, or transformed into furniture. Reality itself bends to his will. He has, by every external metric, won. And yet, watch what Bill actually does during Weirdmageddon. Watch it carefully, not as a viewer enjoying a finale, but as someone trying to understand the psychology of what is happening. Because what Bill does during his moment of absolute triumph is profoundly, almost achingly revealing. He throws a party. Not a strategic consolidation of power. Not an efficient expansion of Weirdmageddon beyond the bounds of Gravity Falls. Not the methodical, patient, trillion-year-in-the-making execution of his actual plan. He throws a party. He makes speeches. He turns the petrified bodies of townspeople into decorative objects and poses them theatrically. He creates a pyramid throne and sits in it. He calls for his henchmen to bring him entertainment. He delivers monologues to audiences who cannot respond. He is, in the most clinical sense of the word, performing. Why?
We touched on this in part 1, but now we need to go further. Because the Weirdmageddon behavior is not just grandiosity. It is not just narcissistic supply seeking. It is something more specific and more psychologically urgent than that. It is displacement. Displacement, in psychological terms, is when the emotional energy that belongs to one thing gets redirected to another. You are angry at your boss, but you cannot express that anger safely, so you come home and snap at your family.
You are terrified about a diagnosis, but you cannot sit with that terror. So you throw yourself into cleaning the house until it is spotless, and then clean it again. The original feeling is too intense, too threatening, too close to something you cannot afford to face, so the mind finds somewhere else to put the energy. Bill Cipher has been working toward Weirdmageddon for thousands of years. It has been the object, the goal, the horizon that organizes everything else. And now he has it. Now the horizon is here. Now there is nothing left to work toward. No next step. No obstacle to overcome. No plan to execute. The goal that has structured his existence is gone. And in the space where it used to be, something dangerous has emerged. Silence. The thing Bill Cipher has been running from has been drowning out with chaos and deals and manipulation, and the continuous noise of his own enormous personality is silence, is stillness, is the moment when there is nothing left to do but be with what you are and what you have done. Weirdmageddon was never really about freedom. It was never really about merging the nightmare realm with the third dimension for its own sake. It was about having something big enough, loud enough, dramatic enough to keep the silence at bay for just a little longer. And now, the biggest and loudest and most dramatic thing Bill could conceive of has arrived, and the silence is right there at the edge of it, waiting. So he performs. He throws the party. He turns up the volume on the chaos as high as it will go. And the party is not enough. It was never going to be enough. There is a moment in Weirdmageddon, easy to miss in the midst of the finale's emotional momentum, where Bill, for just a fraction of a second, is still. Where the performance drops, just slightly, and something else looks out from behind the eye. Something that is not triumphant. Something that is not delighted. Something that is old and tired, and possibly, underneath all the noise, very close to afraid. It lasts only a moment. Then the performance snaps back into place. But it was there, and a psychologist watching that moment would recognize it immediately. That is the face of someone who has arrived at the thing they thought would finally make them feel okay, and discovered that it doesn't, that it can't, that the hunger it was supposed to fill is not the kind of hunger that can be filled by anything external, by any amount of power or chaos or admiration or victory. That hunger is internal. It is the hunger of a being who has never, not once, in 1 trillion years, been willing to grieve what he lost. To say it clearly, to himself, to the universe, to the mother he calls for when he is drunk and the walls come down. I destroyed Uklitian. I killed everyone I knew. I killed my parents. I did not mean to, but I did it, and it cannot be undone. And I am the last one left. Until Bill can say that, until he can actually inhabit that truth rather than running from it, nothing he achieves will ever be enough. Not Weirdmageddon, not merging all of reality, not the destruction of everything. The void does not fill from the outside. It never has. Before we get to Stan, we need to spend a little more time with Ford, because the Ford relationship is the psychological key to everything that happens in Weirdmageddon, and I don't think it gets enough attention. We talked in part 1 about how Bill identified Ford as a specific kind of vulnerable. Brilliant, isolated, carrying significant attachment wounds, hungry for genuine intellectual connection and recognition. We talked about how Bill spent years building the relationship before making his real move. And we talked about the instrumental attachment,
the possibility that something in Bill's response to Ford was not purely strategic. Now I want to talk about what Ford's betrayal actually did to Bill.
Not the strategic inconvenience of losing a pawn, the psychological cost of the rejection itself. Ford's decision to shut down the portal was not just a tactical setback for Bill. In a very specific and important psychological sense, it was a repetition. Think about the structure of what happened. Bill found someone with a gift, a mind that could perceive things others couldn't, a person who was being held back by the limitations of his world. Bill positioned himself as the one who truly understood that gift, who could help it reach its fullest expression, who believed in Ford in a way that no one else had. And Ford, initially, responded to that. Ford opened up. Ford trusted. Ford collaborated. And then Ford pulled away. Ford looked at what their collaboration was building toward, understood what Bill was actually asking him to be part of, and chose to step back. Chose to shut it down. Chose, in the end, the safety of the people around him over the expansion of his own vision.
For Bill Cipher, the psychological template for this is unmistakable. It is Uklitian all over again. The being who sees more, who can perceive a dimension beyond what everyone else can access, who tries to share that vision, who genuinely believes he is offering something extraordinary, and who is refused, who is told, by the action of rejection if not by the words, what you are seeing is not something we can follow you into. And just like in Uklitian, the refusal is not received as a legitimate choice by a free being. It is received as a wound, as a betrayal, as a confirmation of the deepest fear that has been driving Bill since before the massacre, that being himself, truly and fully himself, is something that the people around him will ultimately choose not to accept. The torture that follows, the electrical shocks, the possession, the psychological torment that Ford describes from his time in the nightmare realm, is excessive in a way that tells us something. A purely strategic manipulator, someone who truly felt nothing and needed nothing from the relationship, would simply move on, would find another pawn, would not spend decades tormenting someone who had already served their purpose and failed. The torture is personal. It is the behavior of someone who is hurt, who is, underneath the rage and the cruelty, saying something that sounds like, "How dare you? How dare you be the thing that could have understood me and choose not to? How dare you be another Uklitian?" Bill Cipher has never learned to grieve a loss without first trying to destroy its source, and Ford, to his enormous credit, understood this on some level. The moment in Weirdmageddon where Ford looks at Bill and says something like, "I know what you are. I've always known what you are." This is not surprise or revelation. It is the sorrow of someone who genuinely liked something in the relationship before he understood what it was. Someone who mourns, not the demon, but the possibility of the muse that the demon wore as a mask. The Ford and Bill relationship is one of the most complicated pieces of emotional architecture in all of Gravity Falls. Not because it is a love story, but because it is the story of two fundamentally broken people who found something real in each other and then destroyed it. One of them deliberately. One of them to save himself and the world. And Bill's inability to let it go, the decades of tormenting Ford, the playing of "We'll Meet Again" when he unpetrifies him in Weirdmageddon, the strategic use of that song to re-traumatize a person he once called a friend, this inability is itself the diagnosis. A being who has truly moved on does not play that song. A being who truly felt nothing does not spend 30 years making sure the person who rejected them knows they have not been forgotten. Bill Cipher is not over Ford. He is not over Uklitian. He is not over any of it. He has just learned over 1 trillion years to turn the grief into fire. There is something else that deserves its own section. Something that tends to get overlooked in analyses of Bill Cipher because it does not fit neatly into the narrative of the big villain versus the smart hero. Bill Cipher consistently and systematically underestimated Mabel Pines. Not in the way villains underestimate heroes in the sense of failing to notice their growing strength or competence. Bill underestimated Mabel in a specific psychological way. He categorized her incorrectly. He filed her, early on, into the wrong psychological folder, and that misclassification cost him more than any strategic error he made. Look at how Bill relates to the people around him. His approach to everyone, from Ford to Gideon to Dipper, is based on identifying the core vulnerability and the core desire. What does this person want most? What are they most afraid of?
What is the gap between who they are and who they want to be? Find the gap and you find the lever. With Dipper, the gap is obvious. Dipper wants to be taken seriously, wants to be seen as intelligent and capable and worthy of respect by the adults around him, wants to solve mysteries, to matter, to prove something. Bill reads this immediately and works it throughout their interactions, offering Dipper information, treating him as an intellectual equal, framing their dynamic as a meeting of minds. With Mabel, Bill looks and sees something that does not fit his usual template. He sees optimism, he sees warmth, he sees someone who is not driven by ambition or fear of inadequacy or intellectual hunger. He sees someone who, in his assessment, wants to be happy and loved and surrounded by things that sparkle. And his clinical mind categorizes this as low threat, manageable, not the interesting one. This is the error.
What Bill is actually looking at when he looks at Mabel Pines is something he has never encountered in a trillion years of manipulating and studying conscious beings. He is looking at someone whose primary psychological orientation is not toward self-protection or self-advancement, but toward connection, toward other people, toward love as a mode of being in the world, rather than a strategy or a vulnerability or a source of loss. Mabel Pines is not naive. She is not simple. She is not the comic relief half of a pair, where Dipper is the real protagonist. She is someone whose emotional intelligence operates at a level that Bill Cipher's analytical framework is genuinely unable to process, because his framework is built on the assumption that everyone, at bottom, is primarily motivated by their own needs and fears. Mabel is primarily motivated by love. Not performative love, not instrumental love, not the corrupted pseudo-love that Bill uses as bait in his deals. Real love. The kind that does not calculate what it will get in return. The kind that acts without guarantee. In sock opera, Mabel defeats Bill while he is in Dipper's body, not through intelligence or strategy, but through understanding her brother's specific physical vulnerabilities better than Bill does. She uses knowledge that comes from years of genuine closeness, of paying attention to another person for no reason other than that she loves him. Bill, using Dipper's body, is undone by the fact that Dipper is ticklish. A piece of information you only have if you have spent time genuinely present with another human being. And in the finale, the entire resolution of Weirdmageddon hinges on something similar, on a kind of knowledge, a kind of connection, a kind of love that Bill's trillion-year-old analytical intelligence cannot model. The love between Stan and Ford, the love between the twins, the love of the whole assembled group of people who chose each other. Bill fails in the end because he has never understood this kind of love. Not because he lacks intelligence. He has more intelligence than any being in the show. But because his intelligence is built to process transactions, to model motivations based on self-interest, to identify what people want and offer it to them as bait. It cannot process a being who wants nothing for themselves, who acts entirely out of love for another person, who is willing to sacrifice the very thing that makes them themselves, their memories, their identity, their sense of continuous selfhood, for someone they love. That is Stan's move. And it is the one move in all of reality that Bill Cipher could not see coming. Let's talk about Stan. Stanley Pines is, in many ways, the psychological mirror image of Bill Cipher. Not in the sense of being evil, because Stan is not evil, but in the sense of having been through something structurally similar and emerging from it in the exact opposite direction. Stan was also in childhood the one who did not fit. Where Ford was the brilliant, exceptional twin, the one everyone immediately recognized as special, Stan was the other one. The one who got poor grades. The one who got into trouble. The one whose father, Philbrick, eventually kicked out of the house when he was a teenager and told, in no uncertain terms, that he was a disappointment. That he did not belong. Stan was told, repeatedly and consistently, that he was not enough. That his way of being in the world, his particular intelligence, his particular skills,
his particular way of connecting with people through charm and humor and a kind of sideways, scrappy creativity. These things were not the right kind of intelligence or skill or creativity. They were the lesser kind. Now, think about what each of these beings, Bill and Stan, did with that wound.
Bill took the wound of not being accepted, of his perception being told it was wrong, of being suppressed by the people closest to him, and he converted it into contempt, into distance, into a trillion-year project of being so powerful, so far above the possibility of being rejected again, that rejection itself would become meaningless. He built walls. He built armor. He built a self that was so enormous and so untouchable that no one could ever tell him again that he was too much. Stan took a different path. Stan, after being rejected by his father, after losing his brother, after 30 years of grinding and failing and trying and being wrong about things and having to start over, did not become someone who closed off. He became someone who loved harder. Someone who, the more life knocked him down, the more fiercely he held on to the people who mattered to him. The more ridiculous and difficult and unreasonable his love became, the more completely he gave it anyway.
Stan spent 30 years building a machine to bring back a brother who might not have wanted to come back. Not because it was rational, not because he could be certain it would work, not because he had any guarantee that Ford would forgive him, but because Ford was his brother, and some part of Stan simply could not accept a world where that connection was permanently severed without him at least trying everything he had to restore it. That is the opposite of Bill. That is the exact opposite. Bill, when faced with loss, builds walls so that he can never lose again. Stan, when faced with loss, tears the walls down and runs toward the thing he is most afraid of losing. And so when it comes to the moment that ends Weirdmageddon, when Stan has to offer his mind as the cage that traps Bill, when the memory gun is turned on him and he has to sit there and let 30 years of everything he has built and everyone he has become be erased, he can do it. Not easily, not without cost.
The scene is one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the show, precisely because we understand exactly what he is giving up. He can do it because the love is bigger than the fear. This is what Bill Cipher has never been able to manage, not in a trillion years. His love, whatever version of it he is capable of, is always smaller than the fear. The fear of being hurt again, the fear of being seen and found lacking, the fear of the buzzing in the ears, the fear of what is at the bottom of the 30-second blackout. And so the final defeat of Bill Cipher is not a battle of powers. It is a battle of psychologies. It is a demonstration that the architecture Bill has spent a trillion years building, the grandiosity and the deals and the performance and the omniscience and the walls and the armor, this architecture, for all its scale and sophistication, is fundamentally more fragile than the simple, irrational, unconditional love of a man who chose his brother. You cannot manipulate that. You cannot model it. You cannot see it coming, because it doesn't come from self-interest. And all of Bill's models of consciousness are built on the assumption of self-interest. Bill Cipher, for all his power, was defeated by something he was never able to understand, by someone who loved more than they feared. If you're still with me, thank you. We're getting close to the end now. We have one more major section to move through, and then we'll close slowly and gently, the way we always do. If you're somewhere between waking and sleeping right now, that's exactly where you should be. Let the words become something softer. Let them be less about understanding and more about feeling, about the quiet weight of a story that is also, in the ways that matter, about something real. The stars are out somewhere. The Pacific Northwest is dark and forested and strange, and in a town that no one quite remembers, the mysteries have been solved, and the demon is contained, and the people who loved each other found their way back to each other. Rest a little more. We'll be done soon. The therapism. In the cosmology of the Book of Bill, after the events of Weirdmageddon, after Stan's sacrifice and the memory gun and the destruction of Bill's physical form,
Bill does not simply cease to exist. He ends up shattered and diminished before the axolotl, the ancient, enormous entity that exists outside of normal dimensional space and that seems to operate as something like a cosmic arbiter. And the axolotl, rather than simply ending Bill, gives him something stranger and more uncomfortable than destruction. He gives him a trial. He puts him somewhere, a place outside of time, a prison that is also, in some sense, a therapeutic environment, a place where the armor cannot help, where the deals cannot be struck,
where there is no audience to perform for, no chaos to disappear into, no next plan to distract from the present moment. The therapism. The name is not accidental. It is specifically and deliberately a therapeutic space, a place designed not to punish, but to process, to force a confrontation, however slow and however resistant, with the things that have been avoided. And what does Bill do in the therapism? He draws red and blue triangles on the walls, over and over, red and blue, the colors of his parents, Scalene and Euclid, dead for 1 trillion years, reduced to a single atom in a hat that no longer exists, drawn compulsively, repeatedly, on the walls of the place where Bill has finally run out of running. This is one of the most quietly devastating images in all of Gravity Falls lore. Not because it is spectacular. It is the opposite of spectacular. It is a being alone in a room, making the same two shapes over and over in the colors of the people he killed and lost and has spent 1 trillion years refusing to grieve. What does it mean psychologically? In trauma therapy, there is a phenomenon sometimes called the return of the repressed. It does not mean the repressed material suddenly floods back in with full force. That almost never happens, at least not sustainably. What it means is that the material that has been suppressed, the memory or the feeling or the loss that the mind has been refusing to look at, begins to find its way to the surface in oblique ways, in images that keep returning, in patterns of behavior that repeat without clear conscious motivation, in art sometimes, in the things a person makes when they are not thinking about what they are making. Bill Cipher draws his parents. He does not remember their faces with full clarity. He cannot look at the memory directly without the buzzing and the blackout, but his hands remember the colors. And in the forced stillness of the therapism, with nowhere left to go and nothing left to do, his hands draw the only thing they have always, at the most fundamental level, been trying to say something about. I'm sorry, I'm still here. Where did you go? There is also the matter of what Bill says in the therapism about his progress. The Book of Bill suggests that over thousands of years in that space, something shifts. Not a transformation, not a redemption arc in any clean or satisfying sense. Something slower and messier than that. A gradual, reluctant, enormously resistant erosion of the defensive shell. A slow and painful approach to something that might, if it were allowed to go far enough, eventually become honest. Bill makes progress in the therapism.
He admits to his mistakes, eventually, in the way that someone who has been carrying a weight for 10,000 subjective years might finally set it down. Not because they have forgiven themselves, but because they are simply too tired to keep holding it. He gets to the point where he can say, I did it. I destroyed Uklitian. It was me. And then he stops. Because the next step after I did it is, and it matters that I did it. And the people I lost mattered. And the life I have built since, the 1 trillion years of chaos and deals and walls and running, none of it has been the free existence I told myself it was. It has been a prison that I built myself. Out of guilt I refused to carry, and grief I refused to feel. That step, the step from admission to genuine mourning, from acknowledging the fact to actually feeling the weight of it, is the step Bill had not taken when the book ends. It is possibly the hardest step in all of psychology. It is the step where you stop defending yourself against the knowledge of what you did and simply let it land. The question of whether Bill Cipher will ever take that step is left deliberately open. The book does not give us a redemption.
it gives us something more honest than that. It gives us a being who is, for the first time in a trillion years, actually in the room with the truth. Whether he can stand to stay there is a question the universe has not yet answered. This is the question that floats above everything we have discussed tonight. The question that fans have argued about since the show ended. The question that the Book of Bill opens up and then, deliberately, does not close. Can Bill Cipher change? Let me be careful about how I approach this, because it is a question that psychology takes seriously in a specific way that popular culture sometimes misunderstands.
The popular understanding of change, particularly in the context of villains and redemption arcs, tends to be binary. Either a character changes, in which case they are redeemed, or they don't, in which case they are irredeemably evil. The question of whether someone can change gets treated as a question of their essential nature. Are they fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? Psychology does not work this way. The question psychology asks is not, can this person change, but what would change require? What are the conditions that would need to be present for genuine transformation to occur? And what are the obstacles, internal and external, that stand in the way? For Bill Cipher, the obstacles are specific and enormous and have been in place for a very long time. First and most fundamentally, genuine change requires the willingness to grieve. Not to acknowledge loss intellectually, not to admit in a detached way that something was lost, but to actually feel the grief, to let it move through you, to let it change the shape of who you are and the other side of it. This is what the therapism is slowly pushing Bill toward, and it is the thing that every defense he has ever built has been designed to prevent. Second, genuine change requires what therapists call accountability without self-destruction. This is the narrow path that makes change possible, and that most people, and most beings, find almost impossibly difficult to walk. You have to be able to say what you did was wrong, and I did it, and it mattered, and it cannot be undone, without that acknowledgement destroying your sense of self entirely. Because if the acknowledgement destroys you, you cannot stay with it long enough for it to do its work. You have to be able to hold the knowledge of your own wrongdoing and still remain standing. For Bill Cipher, this is perhaps the hardest of all the obstacles, because the defensive structure he has built, the grandiosity and the contempt and the performance and the walls, is not just something that protects him from external threats. It is what holds him together. It is the architecture of the self. And to dismantle it, even partially, even in the controlled environment of the therapism, risks the very coherence of the being that has been built on top of it. This is why trauma therapists work slowly, why they do not simply point at the wound and demand that the patient look at it. Because the defenses, as destructive as they are, were built for a reason. They were built because at the moment of their construction, they were the only thing that made continued existence possible. And you cannot simply take them away without offering something that can hold the person together while they learn to be held differently. What holds Bill Cipher in the therapism is the therapism itself, the external structure of the containment, the forced stillness, the removal of all the usual escape routes. But that is not the same as Bill having built, internally, the capacity to hold himself, to stay with the grief and the accountability without the walls, to become a being whose sense of self does not depend on never feeling the 30-second blackout. So can he change? Possibly. Slowly. With enormous resistance and partial progress and setbacks that look like regressions but are actually the necessary lurching, non-linear movement of any genuine psychological transformation. The Book of Bill gives us the beginning of a process, not the conclusion. And I think that honesty, that refusal to offer easy resolution, is one of the most psychologically mature things Gravity Falls has ever done. Bill Cipher might change. The conditions are, for the first time in a trillion years, present. The possibility exists. Whether possibility becomes reality is a question that belongs to Bill, not to the story, not to us. Before we get to our closing thoughts, there is one more piece of lore I want to sit with. One more fragment that illuminates the whole picture in a way that nothing else quite does. The axolotl poem. At a specific point in Gravity Falls, the axolotl, the immense entity that exists outside of time and space, delivers a piece of poetry that describes Bill Cipher. It is brief, it is cryptic, and it is, if you read it slowly, one of the most emotionally complete descriptions of a fictional character I have ever encountered. The poem describes a being who watches from within birch trees, who is one of us, not three, not two, who was always looking through, who saw his own dimension burn, who misses home and can't return. Misses home and can't return. Let that sit with you for a moment. Not that home was destroyed, not that home no longer exists, but that he misses it and cannot return. The phrasing suggests something more than simple physical impossibility. It suggests something psychological. Something like, even if the dimensions still existed, even if the atoms were somehow reassembled, even if Uklitian were restored in every physical detail, he could not go back. Because going back would mean going back as the being who destroyed it. It would mean facing what he is. And that, the facing of what he is the one journey he has not been able to take, not in 1 trillion years, not with all his power and all his intelligence and all his performance and all his chaos. The axolotl sees him clearly, more clearly than Bill sees himself. And what the axolotl sees is not primarily the monster. The monster is there, yes. The poem does not pretend it isn't. But underneath the monster, underneath the demon and the deals and the destruction, the poem sees the homesick child, the being who burned his world down trying to share what he saw in it, who has been wandering ever since through dimensions that can never be home because he was the one who made sure his home could never exist again. This is the emotional center of Bill Cipher's entire character. Not the chaos, not the power, not the deals or the manipulation or the trillion-year plan. The center is this: a being who destroyed the only place he ever belonged and has been running from that knowledge through every dimension in existence for longer than most civilizations have existed, without ever being able to stop and say clearly to himself or to anyone else what it actually was. I destroyed my home. I killed my parents. I ended everything I came from, and I have been filling the silence ever since. The axolotl poem is the universe's compassionate acknowledgement of that, not forgiveness, not absolution, something more quiet and more honest than either of those things. A recognition, a yes, I see you, a yes, this is what happened. A yes, the wound is real, even though the monster is also real, even though both things can be true at the same time. Both things are true about Bill Cipher, and both things have been true from the very beginning. We are nearly at the end of our journey tonight, and I want to close not with more analysis, but with something a little more personal, something about why any of this matters, why Bill Cipher is worth spending this much time with, why millions of people across more than a decade since Gravity Falls began have felt something when they encounter this character that goes beyond the normal experience of watching a cartoon villain. Bill Cipher resonates because he is built out of things we recognize, not the omnipotence or the chaos or the triangular form, not the deals or the Weirdmageddon or the billion-year age. Those are the costume. The costume is wild and extraordinary and genuinely fun, but the costume is not what makes him feel real. What makes him feel real is underneath. It is the child who could see something others couldn't see and was told the problem was with the seeing. It is the wound of being too much, too different, too inconvenient for the people who were supposed to love you most. It is the catastrophe that happens when you try to share your vision and it ends in fire. It is the trillion years of running from that fire. It is the grandiosity that is built not from confidence, but from a terror so deep that it had to be turned into armor to be survivable. It is the deals that are the closest thing to love a broken person can manage. It is the humor that processes the pain before it can be felt.
It is the drunk crying for a mother who has been gone longer than human civilization has existed. These are not villainous things in their origin. They are survival things. They are the shapes that a mind takes when its early experiences teach it that being itself is dangerous, that needing others is dangerous, that genuine connection ends in fire. And they are things that real people, in smaller and quieter and entirely human versions, know something about. Not everyone who watches Gravity Falls has destroyed a dimension, but some of them have destroyed something: a relationship, a family, a person they loved, and they are living, as Bill lives, in the aftermath of that destruction, trying to find a way to be in the world that does not require looking directly at what they did. Not everyone who watches Gravity Falls was told as a child that their way of seeing was wrong, but many of them were. Were told they were too sensitive, too strange, too loud, too quiet, too much, not enough. Were handed a version of themselves that fit into the world better than the version they actually were, and asked to wear it indefinitely. Not everyone who watches Gravity Falls uses grandiosity to avoid feeling small, but some of them do. Build enormous personalities, enormous projects, enormous noise to keep the small and frightened thing inside from being audible. Bill's Cipher is a mirror, a specific, carefully crafted, absolutely over-the-top mirror built out of a fictional demon's trillion-year history, but a mirror nonetheless. And when you look at him closely, when you follow his psychology all the way from Uklitian to the therapism, what you are doing is not just analyzing a cartoon character. You are being given a vocabulary, a way of seeing certain kinds of damage, a way of understanding how a being, any being, gets from a lullaby about sharp angles and a mother's love to the attempted destruction of reality. How the steps connect, how each choice makes sense in the context of the one before it, how the monster and the child are the same being, separated only by a trillion years of refusing to grieve. And maybe, if that vocabulary is useful to you, it is not only because of Bill. Maybe it is because you know someone like Bill, someone whose grandiosity is armor, someone whose humor processes pain before it can land, someone who makes deals instead of connections and calls it freedom, someone who has been running for a long time from something that happened a long time ago. Maybe it is because some part of that is, in the small and human way, you. And if it is, I want to say something quietly, here at the end of a very long night, while you are in that soft place between awake and asleep, where things can sometimes land that cannot land in the full brightness of day. The therapism is not a punishment. It is a beginning. It is the first place in a trillion years where a being who had been running was finally made to be still. And in the stillness, slowly, impossibly slowly, at the pace of geological time, something began to shift. Stillness is available to you, too. Not as a prison. As a choice. As the decision to sit with what you have been running from long enough to let it say what it has been trying to say. The buzzing in the ears, the 30-second blackout, the thing you cannot look at directly. It is not going to destroy you. It did not destroy Bill Cipher, even though he spent a trillion years convinced that it would. It just waited. It waited with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. And it is still waiting, whenever you are ready. We have come a very long way tonight. We started in Uklitian, in a flat world with flat dreams, with a child who could see a direction that no one around him could see. We followed that child through the catastrophe that ended his world and through the trillion years of running that followed. We watched him become a demon, become a dealer, become a god of chaos and a god of deals, and finally, briefly, terrifyingly, a god of a pocket reality in a small town in the Pacific Northwest that no one quite remembers. We watched him lose. Not to superior power, not to superior intelligence, to love. To the one thing he had never been able to model, never been able to predict, never been able to protect himself against. the love of people who chose each other so completely that they were willing to sacrifice the very fabric of their own continuous selfhood in service of that choice. And then we watched what happened after, the therapism, the red and blue triangles on the walls, the slow, reluctant, infinitely painful beginning of a process that may or may not lead anywhere, that the universe is watching with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. What a psychologist would say about Bill Cipher is this. They would say, here is a being whose original wound was being told that his perception was wrong, who responded to that wound by building a self so enormous that no one could ever tell him that again.
Who spent 1 trillion years in that construction, adding wall to wall, armor to armor, performance to performance, until the self that was doing the building was so buried under what had been built that it was barely accessible even to the being it belonged to. They would say, the defensive structure made sense, given the wound. The wound was real. The fear was real. The need to never be small, never be suppressed, never be told that what you see is not what is real. This need was built out of something that actually happened and that actually hurt. They would say, and none of that makes what he did okay. The harm was real. The people he destroyed, the dimensions he burned, the lives he twisted and broke and ended. Those were real people, real lives, real losses. The insight into the origin of the behavior does not undo the behavior. And they would say, and he is still here, still in the therapism, still drawing red and blue,
Still, slowly, achingly slowly, approaching the thing he has been running from. Whether he makes it the rest of the way is a question the universe has not answered. Whether any of us make it the rest of the way is always a question the universe has not answered. We are always, all of us, somewhere in the middle of our own journey from the wound to the wholeness. Some of us are in the Uklitian, still building the walls. Some of us are in the nightmare realm, mistaking the absence of rules for freedom. Some of us are in the Weirdmageddon, throwing the biggest party we know how to throw to avoid the silence. And some of us are in the therapism, sitting with it, drawing the shapes of what we lost on the walls of the only place we have left to be. There is no shame in any of those places. There is only the question of what you do next. The next step is always available. Even if you have been in the same place for 1 trillion years, the next step is always available.
Okay, that's everything for tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making it all the way through. This was a long one, and I know it went to some heavy places, and I hope it felt worth it. I hope something in it was useful to you, or at least interesting, or at least a comfortable companion for the long, quiet hours. If you're still awake, close your eyes now. Let the day and everything in it become distant. The analysis is done. The questions have been asked. There is nothing more to figure out tonight. Just breathe. Just rest. Just let yourself be here, in this moment, without anything to solve or understand or carry. The night is quiet. The mysteries, for now, are settled. Sleep well, everyone. I'll see you next time.